did, because I was a killer. And I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud of that at all.
Everyone is afraid. No soldier is without fear, but it has to be overcome.
You couldn't feel sorry for anybody else.
It's hit or be killed. That's the long and the short of it.
El Alamein and Arnhem, battles that shaped the future of the world. The Ardennes, Monte Cassino, and Dunkirk. In World War II Revisited, we go back with soldiers who fought on both sides of those epic struggles. Men who 60 years ago were implacable enemies meet now, sometimes for the first time, at the scenes of some of the most brutal battles of the Second World War. In this program, an Englishman and a German meet at Normandy, the scene of some of the war's most bitter fighting during the great Allied invasion of Europe that began in June 1944.
I can't forget it, of course, especially certain details. They stay firmly in your memory. They are experiences that you will be able to recall after 100 years, and that you can't forget.
The thoughts, the morality of it comes in later on when you sit back and think about it afterwards. But we didn't think about it at that time. I mean, all we wanted to do is to wait, to get through and get on our way.
Few campaigns in the history of warfare can have been as meticulously planned as the famous D-Day landings in June 1944. Continental Europe had been in German hands for more than 4 years, and now, with the tide of the war turning decisively in favor of the Allies, the time had come to strike back. Hitler's Fortress Europe was about to be put to the test. The Allied Supreme Commander for the operation, codenamed Operation Overlord, was the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The commander of the invasion itself was the British General Bernard Montgomery, who was at the head of a combined Anglo-American and Canadian force of some 156,000 men. It was to be the greatest amphibious invasion ever mounted, and little was left to chance. The Allies had an overwhelming superiority in men, ammunition, ships, planes, and tanks. This was to be the force that would push Hitler's armies back towards its own borders. Supported by a massive artillery bombardment from Allied battleships that would penetrate as far as 20 miles inland, it was planned that 4 Allied corps would land on the beaches of northern France and capture the towns of Bayeux and Caen. Within 10 days of the landings, they were ordered to secure the high ground that ran from Saint-Lô to Villers-Bocage. Then, as British forces took on the Germans to the south of Caen, General Patton's US Third Army were to move southwards, encircling the German forces. The plan called for the capture of Paris within 90 days of the D-Day landings. Privates Frank Rosier and Tony Colgan were among the Allied soldiers who were about to invade Fortress Europe.
The whole idea of the Normandy invasion was superbly thought out, and they gave us equipment, the best equipment they could possibly find. So you knew that they'd done all they could for you. You always had this idea that you were going to win. There was never a question of we were going to come up. There was no a chance that we would get pushed off that beachhead, no matter what the books might say since, but there wasn't a chance because we were so confident.
I would say we were the best equipped, fittest army ever to leave these shores to go and fight. And fitness was extremely important. I don't think I've ever been as fit as I was then.
In contrast, the Wehrmacht forces were recouping from the horrors of the Eastern Front. Artillery Captain Walter Heinlein was in the elite 2nd Panzer Division, resting in northern France.
Wir waren zur Art Besatzung oder Auffrischung oder
We were in the area around Amiens for training and convalescence.
da waren wir zum Teil in Schlössern untergebracht.
Some of us were quartered in chateaux, and we made a good recovery.
Konnten auch mal in ausgehen.
We were allowed to visit cafes and restaurants,
Und von da aus
and from there,
dann
we were given the order to transfer to the north of France,
nach Frankreich, nach Nordfrankreich, weil ja in der
because the invasion had begun.
die Invasion begonnen hatte.
On the 6th of June 1944, after weeks of preparation, planning and training, the Allied invasion force stormed ashore on the French beaches, the code names of which have a special place in military history. Sword, Juno, Gold, Utah and Omaha. Despite the month-long bombardment of the German positions that had preceded the landings and the elaborate Allied deceptions that had convinced the Germans they would come to the north in the Pas-de-Calais region, there was fierce German resistance on some of the beaches. This was particularly true of Omaha Beach, where the American 16th and 116th Regiment combat teams were pinned down by the crack German 352nd Division. It took the whole day for the US troops to fight their way off the beach, leaving behind them 2,500 casualties. Further up the coast at Gold Beach, Frank Rosier and his Gloucester Regiment had come ashore 3 hours after the initial assault.
The immediate thing that came to me was the noise, was the battleships firing rockets and things behind us. And I think the noise is quite indescribable. They're huge bang, you can't actually explain it. We ran like hell up that beach, and though the situation was sniping and shells were falling around us, it wasn't intense enough to cause us a great deal of casualties, as I just said. But it was very frightening to take it up. But we were so well trained, we did the job that we were trained.
In all, 2,500 Allied troops were killed on that first day of the invasion of Europe. A further 8,500 became casualties. The reward for such sacrifice was that by the end of the crucial first day, most of the Allied objectives had been achieved, with one major exception: the capture of Caen. The city that should have been in Allied hands by the 7th of June refused to fall and was to remain under German control until the 18th of July, a full 6 weeks after the beginning of the battle. D-Day marked the start of the campaign to liberate northern France. Nearly 60 years after that pivotal event, we took World War II veterans Les Dining, a tank driver of the 7th Armoured Division, and German veteran Walter Heinlein, a frontline artillery spotter, back to the battlefields of Normandy. In contrast to that blistering summer of 1944, they meet on a cold, rainy day at Villers-Bocage, a battlefield synonymous with that epic conflict.
Oh, comrade! Comrade Englishman!
Yes, indeed.
Yes, sad to see you.
It's nice to see you.
Yes. Aber heute sind wir Freunde, Kameraden.
Today we are comrades, friends, and say no more war.
Absolutely, absolutely, no more war.
But
No.
oh, no friends.
Yes.
No friends.
Yep. Great, yeah, great. No, I'm pleased that he survived just as I did. Who knows? I could have fired at him, and he could have fired at me. But I think the fact that I'm still here, and the fact that he's still here, we could say we both missed.
In the first few days after the invasion, Les landed with his tank unit, while Walter's Panzer Artillery Regiment made its way to Caen to aid in the defence of the city. As the two reminisce on Gold Beach, their stories highlight the differing fortunes of the two sides as the offensive began.
Well, this is where I landed, at the crack of dawn on June the 7th, 1944. When we got off the landing craft, the fighting had actually moved slightly inland, and it was relatively quiet. I think I spent most of my time smoking, drinking the cocoa, looking out at the warships, certainly the destroyers, weaving in and out of the landing craft and the landing ships. It was relatively quiet, apart from the battleships firing salvos behind us. They were landing well inland, round about where Walter was. I shouldn't be surprised.
Nun, so einfach war das auch an der Weide im Hinterland.
It wasn't so easy. We were far back inland and had to make our way slowly here from Paris. And we realized that we just couldn't drive during the day, because the Spitfires and the Thunderbirds and whatever they were called came down onto every single one of our vehicles and immediately shot many of them up in flames.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
When we had advanced further, they fired the ship's guns, which were this big, and were fired inland, and whoever lived through those, they came over like the heaviest bombs and had an enormous effect.
For the Allied soldiers, the relief at making it onto the beaches was soon quelled by the realization of the enormity of the task that lay in front of them as they moved inland. As Frank Rosier recalls,
we were sent through what's called an OP, forward patrol, to watch up the road to Tilly-sur-Seulles. And there was a crucifix up the side of the road, and at that time there was a sweet shop on the other side of the road which was burning. And up on the hill, or the brow of the hill, was German tanks, what we would call hull down. That means just their guns pointing over the brow of the hill at us. And I belted across this road with another chap into this sweet shop because chocolates, they had chocolates, and the chocolates were on ration at home. And I stuffed my battle belts full of chocolates, run back across the road, dived behind where we were fairly safe behind this crucifix. And the sweet shot, one of the tanks was obviously spotted us, and he just blew the shop to pieces. And Sergeant Frayne, one of the older men in the battalion, a Scotch chap, he turned and said to me one day, "You'll bloody grow up, Rosie, you'll get us all killed." And it was then I thought, yeah, this isn't a scheme, this is real.
as the Allies advanced into Normandy, the Germans continued to offer stiff resistance, especially around the area of Caen. One important factor in the successful German defense of Caen was the terrain in which the battle was fought. The Bocage region of France was a closely packed area of narrow, sunken lanes and high-banked hedgerows that surrounded small fields. This was ideal defensive terrain, where anti-tank guns and machine gun nests could be easily concealed. The Allies may have had an enormous advantage in numbers of tanks, but in the claustrophobic world of the Bocage, German anti-tank teams were able to get close enough to attack and destroy them. Here, the German defenders held all the cards, and the Bocage was soon nicknamed the Green Hell by the Allied soldiers.
The Normandy Bocage was clearly not designed for tanks, and it was war by ambush. It was fighting by ambush, basically. You had to stick to the tracks, narrow as they were. And of course, the Germans knew you were coming, and the first one to get there was taken out.
It wasn't like the First War where you got a long trench system. You might have, Frank will tell you more now, that you have a group of soldiers, probably 2 or 3 slip trench, and it might be 50 yards or so before another one come along. So you could be infiltrated as easily as you could infiltrate them, because they hadn't got the men any more than we had.
Walking back down to rejoin my unit, suddenly out the hedge, 2 yards if that away, stood this big blonde German lad, no hat, no helmet. He had his gun slung across the back, mine was on my shoulder, the Sten gun again, and I just fired it, and I sat on the ground. Oh, I killed him. Stone dead, you know, cut him in half virtually, those bullets. And I was sick and bad, and I see that man's face now as I'm talking to you, as clear as day, as I can see yours. It's stuck in my memory. Horrible.
As Frank Rosier had found out, the maze-like greenery of the Bocage did not always favour the Germans. Nearly 60 years on from the events in Normandy, Walter Heinlein and Les Dining returned to Villers-Bocage, and Walter recalls the dangers of fighting in the Green Hell.
We were in Normandy, and the terrain was just as it is here. Many hedges, fenced-in areas with a farmyard in between here and there, but always hedges, and not many big hills, so that you could only see the enemy when he came through the hedge. On one occasion, the hedge suddenly parted, and I saw enemy soldiers and suddenly a barrel of a gun. They couldn't just fire into the hedge in front of me because their shell would have exploded prematurely and not have harmed my vehicle. They needed a clear field of fire. So the battle really depended on who was the fastest. Sometimes the English got the better of us because they were able to turn faster.
Because they were unable to take Caen, the Allies had to keep fighting in the Bocage, and more men became casualties. Soon, the airfield at Caupiquet, on the outskirts of Caen, became a strategically vital target. But the infamous Hitler Youth Division tenaciously defended it. The division held on to the airfield, despite a series of determined assaults by the Allies. This remarkable feat was achieved despite the young age of the German recruits. The shortage of men in the German army led to a growing number of young boy soldiers being drafted into the conflict. Frank Rosier recalls the shock of having to fight them.
Coming down the road were German tin hats on legs. 2 little mastic legs. Open fire. Sir, they're boys. Open bloody fire. They'll kill you as well as they're firing at you. Their bullets kill you. And we opened fire, and of course they were Hitler Youth. But I think the eldest of them must have been 14. Think how we felt. You know, think how we felt. You know, they were kiddies. And we were 18, 19. We weren't much older.
Unable to take the airfield because of the stiff German resistance, Montgomery dispatched his 7th Armoured Division, the renowned Desert Rats, to make a broad sweep to the south around Caen on June the 12th. The attack was aimed at the small town of Villers-Bocage, and it was here that one of the most famous tank actions of the entire war was fought. The Allied advance was halted and almost single-handedly destroyed in a fierce battle through the streets and fields surrounding Villers-Bocage by German tanks of the 101st Heavy Battalion, led by their commander, Michael Wittmann. The British armoured column had stopped to make tea when Michael Wittmann's Tiger tank emerged from cover and, after knocking out a rear tank, drove down the column at close range, destroying the vehicles as he went. In Villers-Bocage itself, Wittmann continued to destroy further British tanks. Patrick Dyer, himself a tank commander in that famous battle, remembers his confrontation with the German Panzer Ace.
I'd pulled back into somebody's farmyard, wisely, I think. And then I suddenly saw a bloody great German Tiger tank passing slowly across in front of me. But I'd let my gunner get out to spend a penny. So he couldn't have shot, and I wouldn't have helped if I had. The only way to get him with our feeble tanks was to hit him in the rear. So I said to the driver down the intercom, "Follow that tank." And he did. Trouble was, we followed him a bit down this main street, and the bloody man had met one of our other tanks down the other end of the street and had turned round. So we met each other facing at about 400 yards, which was for me murder. So I got in 2 shots because I knew he was there, but they just bounced off the front of his tank. He then had a shot and it didn't bounce off. My gunner was killed. The other man in front was killed jumping out. Driver got out, he was safe, and I was blown out the top, and I'd been wounded in the face, I didn't know it. And so I ran across the street to the Sergeant Major's tank, saw the dead driver sitting in his seat with his ginger hair and his head split in 2, and the wireless set was hanging down and crackling. So I grabbed the wireless and I was able to tell the rest of the regiment what was going on. And there was a tiger in the main street, which helped them. And then some stupid Germans were shooting at me with Spandau, a machine gun. So I decided to quit. So I ran back across the road and jumped a hedge, and there was a French girl who said, "Mon Dieu, venez avec moi." So, well, I've never vened avec a French girl as quickly as before.
For the Allies, Villers-Bocage was a disaster. In a single day, more than 60 British tanks were lost, and the Germans destroyed many more armoured vehicles. The only consolation for the 7th Armoured Division after such a costly day was their resistance to the German counterattack which followed.
Casualties were heavy and morale for a time was very low. But when we got back, we were pulled back to the high ground behind Villers-Bocage.
On the high ground you can see behind me a box of roughly 1,200 by 1,500 yards. And the entire fighting force of the division centred itself in this box. And the following morning, the German forces threw everything they had at us in an attempt to penetrate the box and eliminate us, because we were a real threat to their position. We had, in fact, penetrated some 12 miles into their lines, and they tactically, of course, it was a disaster for the German forces.
The Germans attacked us in force 3 times, and we could mow them down. By then the anti-tank regiment had arrived, and we had the support of the Rifle Brigade. And our firepower was much too great for the Germans.
It was chaotic. The scene was, dramatic, to say the least.
And at one moment, the Germans were coming in arm to arm, and we just mowed them down. It was like the First World War carnage. Absurd. It should never happen.
Even though the Germans had been pushed back, Villers-Bocage was still in their hands, and the Allies had to accept that the battle for Normandy would not be the mobile battle which the Allied planners had hoped for. During the last 3 weeks of June, General Montgomery continued to wrestle with the problem of the stalemate around Caen. His solution was an enormous assault, codenamed Operation Epsom, that was launched on the 26th of June 1944. This, too, was to end in costly failure, as despite the fearsome artillery bombardment that pounded the defences around the Carpiquet airfield, the Germans somehow held their ground. But the endless defensive toil was sapping German morale, as Walter Heinlein recalls.
We were in despair. We were there with the best weapons and weren't allowed to attack. We were an attack troop and were used to attacking, nothing to do with defense, attack, as we had always done. We had to let ourselves be destroyed by the planes and the ship's guns. That hurts. Stay still, everything comes down on top of us, and we did nothing.
The 15th Scottish Infantry Division was very badly mauled during the fighting, and the Epsom offensive came to a shuddering halt less than 4 miles from its starting position. Even worse, the British Second Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey, withdrew from the small gains that had been made. The city of Caen simply refused to fall, and the beachheads behind the Allied front line became more and more jammed as troops and supplies continued to pour ashore. Unable to move inland, the congestion itself soon became a barrier to progress, while every passing day left the Allied troops increasingly vulnerable to German counterattack. The Allies also desperately needed the use of an airfield, and the one at Carpiquet was still with the Germans. Losing patience, Montgomery decided to take a sledgehammer to Caen. It was to be attacked and captured in a full frontal assault codenamed Operation Charnwood, which was to begin on the 8th of July. The terrible fighting during Operation Charnwood had echoes of earlier savage battles at hellish places such as Monte Cassino and Stalingrad. Before the attack began, no fewer than 467 British and Canadian bombers flew in a succession of devastating raids designed to destroy the city's defences and soften up the Germans who cowered beneath the dropping bombs. There was no regard for the lives of the civilians within the walls of the city, and they suffered a dreadful fate. More than 10,000 became casualties. The bombing also created a wilderness of rubble and bomb craters that provided a ready-made series of almost impenetrable defences. For the Germans, many of whom had seen action at Stalingrad and Monte Cassino, the ruins of Caen were a heaven-sent opportunity to use their hard-won experience in defending flattened cities. Faced with these conditions, the Allied attacks on the city were thrown back time and again, until once again the increasing numbers of dead and wounded forced Montgomery to call a halt to Operation Charnwood. Only one glimmer of light illuminated the gloom. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles had finally succeeded in ousting the Hitler Youth Division and had captured the airfield at Carpiquet. The battle for the airfield mirrored the fighting in the surrounding bocage, with both sides sustaining heavy casualties. Frank Rosier can still remember the horrors of the Normandy battlefield as he attacked under shell fire.
And on this particular occasion, as I landed on the ground, and you don't get down, you fly down, this chap 30 yards away, hand suddenly come in front of me. He's a direct hit with a shell. Imagine 19 years or 18 years old as I was, and I was terrified. The other occasion, you're going across a field and you're fighting tanks, and they fire in other tanks, solid shell, more than possibly an HE. And this happened to me again. The chap in front of me this time, they fire a solid shell, and suddenly he was headless. Solid shell just gone onto the tank. It ain't fun, and most of the time you're terrified. You are making, you know, but somehow your training and what you've been taught keeps you cool enough to fight. And the German boys themselves, I mean, they needed guts and courage to stay where they were, because they had far more coming at them in Normandy than we did at us.
Even though they continued their dogged resistance, German High Command realized the hopelessness of their overall position. The German generals von Rundstedt and Rommel begged to be allowed to make a fighting withdrawal to a position between the Loire and Orne rivers, where they'd be able to consolidate and build up reserves in preparation for a counteroffensive. Hitler was having none of it, and just as at Stalingrad and El Alamein, he ordered his troops to stand and fight to the last man. For good measure, he sacked von Rundstedt and replaced him with Feldmarschall Kluge. Not that it was sweetness and light on the Allied side. General Eisenhower was becoming impatient for solid progress and somewhat contemptuous of Montgomery's role in the proceedings so far. In response to the urgings of the Supreme Commander, Montgomery planned yet another offensive for the 17th of July that was this time codenamed Operation Goodwood. Operation Goodwood was a massive attack that involved all 4 British and Canadian corps in Normandy. There were so many troops involved that there was a delay of 1 day as all the men and armour were brought into position. By the 18th of July, Goodwood was ready to begin. Another overwhelming air, sea and artillery bombardment opened the offensive, blasting a path for 750 tanks to cut through to the high ground south of Caen. So intense was the barrage that some compared it to those seen during the appalling fighting in Russia. Here, Tiger tanks were flipped into the air like toys, and some German soldiers shot themselves rather than endure the storm of artillery shells. But still, they did not abandon their deep defensive positions.
The barrage starts up and the men are completely nervous wrecks, and then they came to me, clung onto me and sometimes began to cry. We can't stand it anymore. They clung onto me and I thought, all right, I have to set an example. As an officer, I have to. I'm practically invulnerable, so I had to put up with it. Although I was scared too. Who isn't if you're being fired at? But you had to overcome it.
The fighting for the city and its surrounding villages became bloody and prolonged, and yet again the casualties figures began to rise. After 2 days of battle, some Allied observers believed the end to be in sight, but the unthinkable happened. The heavens opened and torrential rain turned the battleground into a quagmire. In these conditions, tanks were useless, and Operation Goodwood, just like Epsom and Charnwood, had to be abandoned.
Operation Goodwood in Normandy, we lost 400 tanks in that operation. We don't possess 400 tanks now. We lost not all knocked out, but some were certainly broken down, tracks off and that kind of thing. But all because we were completely outgunned.
Our men were good. They had experience. We had all come from Russia. And above all, we had the latest tanks, which had good penetration. And in my opinion, were somewhat better than theirs.
If Goodwood had achieved one thing, it was that it had contributed greatly to the steady erosion of manpower and fighting materials that was to signal the end for the German army in Normandy. 113,000 German troops had been lost since the 6th of June. Only 10,000 had been sent to replace them. Just 17 replacement tanks had been sent to the front line. 2,100 had been destroyed. Walter Heinlein remembers how one of those tanks met its fate.
The
A tank was knocked out in front of me. It burns, and the men are down in the tank, and the tank burns immediately because the ammunition is inside it. It explodes, and immediately there's fire and smoke everywhere, and the men try to get out of the hatches or out of the turret, hang half out and burn. Awful.
The British and Canadian efforts had paved the way for the planned American sweep to the south that would completely outflank the German defences. Commanded by General Omar Bradley, it was codenamed Operation Cobra, and it would be the offensive that would finally push the Germans out of the Bocage and allow the Allies to break out southwards into the open countryside of France. On the 25th of July 1944, 1,500 Allied heavy bombers dropped a murderous carpet of bombs on the weakened German 7th Army, and the collapse began. The constant shelling had finally taken its toll on the demoralized German troops, and Operation Cobra swiftly gathered pace. One of the targets that lay in the path of the British was Thury-Harcourt. Frank Rosier remembers the part he played in the attack on that town.
We were the leading three. We got down, three of us, and the next three come down and they got killed. And it was quite a goat path to go down, very difficult to get down. So they shouted down to us, "Stay down there, we'll get you out when it gets dark." Because we were quite happy. We were in a ditch. German machine gun was about 20 yards away, and he kept firing at us, but we were quite safe in the ditch. We had a Bren gun with us, which we put up on the road, kept the mag up, pull the trigger, just say, "We know where you are, you know where we are, let's leave it that way." And we got a pack of cards out. We started playing cards, which got round all the divisions, didn't it, about these three idiots playing cards. And the long short of it was, in the end, if he'd fired us, and there was like a flint cliff behind us, and a piece of this flint came off, and Bertie Figg was with me. The other chap, I think his name was Appleton Appleford, I can't even know his red head, I could draw him more than remember his name. And a piece of this flint just cut him as if he'd nicked himself with a razor, nothing more, just a little nick. And he suddenly said, "I've had enough of this." And he grabbed the Bren gun over the road and wiped that machine gun out. When we come back, I said, "What are you doing?" You know? He said, "Why the hell didn't you stop me?" He got away with it. As a result, because he wiped that machine gun out, we were able to get back up top.
As the British and Canadians continued their push through the Bocage, the Americans continued to try and outflank the Germans through the Avranches Gap. Walter Heinlein's Panzer Division were part of the Mortain counterattack that Hitler believed would cut the Americans off from their allies and foil Operation Cobra. This action was a disaster, and Walter soon experienced the destruction and confusion which would hasten the demise of the Germans in Normandy.
Suddenly there was a crash and I was hurled out of the armoured car. An enemy shell had gone straight through the driver. Everything smashed, of course, everyone dead. I was the only survivor. I just had a slight hand injury. No one knew where to go. Are we encircled or not? Everyone tried to find a gap somewhere. And I found one.
With the other survivors, Walter attempted to get back to his unit. As the group paused for a rest in a farmyard, an American soldier took the men prisoner at gunpoint. Walter takes up the story.
My lieutenant turned round, took the rifle and pressed it down as if to say, "What do you want from me?" I was standing in the doorway of the house, levelled my rifle and shouted, "Hands up." And the American put his hands up. Now it had been reversed and I had him. Well, we talked, and I realized that I still wasn't near our lines, but behind the American lines. We said, "We want to get to our lines, and you want to get to your people, so let's do this. When we get to your lines, then talk to them in English. Stop, we are Americans, and we'll take the opportunity to get across the lines." And that's what we did.
With the enemy overstretched, the British forces took advantage of the confusion in the disintegrating German ranks to form the northern pincer of a huge encircling movement that was designed to entrap the German forces in Normandy in a huge pocket that was centered on the town of Falaise. The scene was well and truly set, and although the Germans fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, the British continued to drive to the south. On the 20th of August, they linked up with the American forces to close a ring around Falaise. At this late hour, Hitler sent Feldmarschall Walter Model to the Falaise pocket with the order to shore up the defences. But even this respected veteran of the Eastern Front could see the utter hopelessness of the German position. Escape was the only option, and he sanctioned the withdrawal through the ever-closing gap. It was an escape fraught with danger, as they were attacked incessantly from the air and from all sides by American and British artillery. Nearly 60 years on, Walter Heinlein and Les Dining returned to Falaise and described their experiences inside and outside the pocket.
We were completely encircled. We realized, because on all sides, wherever we drove, the enemy was already there. The heavy weapons had just about been destroyed because of the attacks, above all from the air. It was chaos. No one knew where to go. Someone this way, the others a different way. It was just chaos. Above all, when a general suddenly appeared beside you and everyone said, "Herr General, what shall we do?" And he didn't know himself. Just get out, save yourself if you can. That was the end.
We could see the typhoons coming in and firing at the vehicles. And these roads here were absolutely solid with vehicles, men, wagons, horse and carts. Things like horse and carts, solid. One vehicle behind the other, two vehicles either side. And the typhoons were coming in and just shooting them up. And it was just a killing ground. It was horrific.
40,000 German troops managed to escape before the Allies closed the jaws of the Falaise pocket. But 60,000 more remained inside, along with the bulk of the German armour. The Allied Air Force swooped in for the kill, as squadron after squadron of rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft pounded the densely packed columns of troops as they struggled to make their escape. Here there were scenes of almost indescribable carnage, as more than 10,000 Germans lost their lives, and 50,000 more were wounded or taken prisoner. Walter Heinlein describes the extreme action which he took to escape from the pocket.
It was difficult to get there. Vehicles on all sides, the open VW jeeps and so on. Suddenly there was a jeep to my left with SS officers inside. I said, "Get out of here, I'll run over you. I have to get through. I have to get my heavy weapons out. I have to go forwards." They didn't do anything. I drove on, and they leapt out. I drove over the jeep, and on we went.
The German army had been forced to flee from their enemy, and these beaten, bleeding men were all that remained of the 60 German divisions that did battle during the struggle for Normandy. With the Falaise action complete, Allied armour could now move south into the open country of France. Les Dining was among the tank units that had to negotiate the wreckage that had once been the German army.
It was a very large, sort of, as I remember it, 6 or 8 wheel German lorry, with the driver sitting in with his hands on the steering wheel with the back of his head just gone. I mean, they were strewn around all over the place. I mean, there was corpse upon corpse upon corpse, horses upon horses upon horses. I mean, you know, dead and bits and pieces. I mean, this is war. when you see such destruction of your opponent, is probably the way to put it. You realise that you're on your way to the winning.
The disaster was almost entirely of Hitler's own making, although as he surveyed the wreckage of his once proud Western Army, he certainly didn't believe that to be so. Cursing the incompetence of his generals, he continued to lead Germany to its final defeat 9 months later. But in Normandy in August 1944, Montgomery had finally won the victory, albeit at great cost. And exactly as planned in Operation Overlord, the Allies were in Paris just 90 days after D-Day.
I never had any hate for the German soldier. He was, as you put it at one stage, somebody there who was born in a different country and perhaps was doing what he had to do.
Who likes to lose a war? But you have to realize that you cannot fight a war against the entire world, and that, in the end, wars should be just. Or could be just. He is a comrade. He had to fight. I am a comrade. I had to fight too.